Some stories start with a scream, others with silence. On a quiet June night in 1980, the town of Antioch, California heard neither. But by morning, one girl was gone, and the river had taken her secret. It was the first week of summer vacation. 14-year-old Suzanne Arlene. Susie Bombardier was spending the night at her sister's home on North Lake Drive, babysitting her two nieces. It was supposed to be a simple evening: pizza, TV, bedtime stories. But sometime between midnight and dawn, Susie vanished. When her sister awoke the next morning, the house was still and quiet, the kind of silence that tells you something's wrong. Susie's belongings were there: her purse, her clothes, her toothbrush, all untouched. But she was gone. Police were called immediately. Antioch officers arrived, searched the home, and quickly realized there were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no struggle. Just an open front door and a missing child. For the next several days, the community searched desperately. Flyers, phone calls, door-to-door checks, but no trace of Suzanne. Then, 5 days later, on June 27, 1980, a fisherman on the San Joaquin River made a discovery he'd never forget. Floating just beneath the surface, caught in the reeds near a levee, was the body of a young girl. She was naked, and she had been stabbed once directly through the heart. The body was soon identified as Suzanne Bombardier, 14 years old, kind, bright, a girl who loved books and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Her death shocked Antioch. It was the kind of small California city where people still left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew everyone. And suddenly, nothing felt safe anymore. Detectives canvassed the area, retraced her last steps, and gathered what little evidence they could. The river had washed away most of it, any footprints, fibers, or trace material that might have told them who had done this. But inside the home where Susie vanished, they collected a few biological samples, tiny invisible clues that would mean nothing for decades. At the time, DNA testing didn't exist. Forensic science could only take the investigation so far. The case went cold and stayed cold. Year after year, Suzanne's file sat in the Antioch Police Department archives, a box of photos, reports, and evidence bags, each labeled unsolved. Her family never stopped asking questions. But with no leads, no witnesses, and no technology to connect the dots, investigators had nothing left to chase. The river had gone silent again, but somewhere in a sealed envelope of evidence, the truth was waiting. For 35 years, the name Suzanne Bombardier gathered dust. Then in 2015, a cold case investigator decided to take one last look inside that old evidence box. Among the files was a single piece of preserved biological evidence, a sample that had never been tested with modern technology. When it was sent for analysis, the results would open a door no one expected and point directly to a man who had once walked the same streets as Suzanne, a man already known to police, a man who thought he'd gotten away with murder. The past was about to speak through DNA, through data, and through the one clue the killer could never erase. When the river finally spoke, it didn't whisper. It screamed the name of the man who had taken her life. When a case goes cold, it doesn't mean it's forgotten. Sometimes justice just needs time and the right technology to thaw it out. In 2015, 35 years after Suzanne Bombardier's murder, Antioch police detective Leonard Orman reopened her file. Orman had spent years in law enforcement, but the Bombardier case was different. It wasn't just old. It was personal to the community. Inside the archive room, he found the original evidence box, faded labels, brittle paper, and plastic bags sealed in the early 1980s. One envelope stood out, a biological sample collected from Suzanne's body during the original autopsy. At the time, in 1980, that evidence meant little. The technology to test it simply didn't exist. But in 2015, forensic science had evolved far beyond what detectives from that era could imagine. DNA profiling had become one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigation. So Detective Orman made a decision. He sent the preserved evidence to the Contra Costa County Crime Lab for reanalysis. It was a long shot, Decades of degradation, heat, moisture, any of it could have ruined the sample. But when the lab technicians began their work, something incredible happened. Against all odds, a complete male DNA profile was extracted. The moment that code appeared on the lab monitor, a string of letters representing a genetic fingerprint, the entire case changed. That profile was then uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. Weeks later, a match came back. The name attached to that DNA hit was Mitchell Lynn Bacon, a man who had lived in Antioch at the time of Suzanne's murder. He wasn't a stranger to police. In fact, he had an extensive criminal history, convictions for sexual assault, burglary, and kidnapping. He had served time, been released, and disappeared into the background of the same community where Suzanne once lived. Investigators began retracing his life, where he had been in 1980, what connections he might have had to Suzanne's family. And what they found painted a chilling picture. Backham had dated a relative of Suzanne's in the late 1970s. He had been inside the home where Suzanne was babysitting. He knew the layout. He knew the family. And that night, he used that knowledge to take advantage of a sleeping girl who trusted him. By late 2017, police had gathered enough evidence to make their move. Detectives quietly built a case, double-checking the DNA findings and collecting supporting material. When the district attorney's office was confident, they signed the arrest warrant. On December 11, 2017, officers moved in. Mitchell Lynn Backham, 63 years old, was arrested at his home in Antioch, the same city he had haunted for decades. The man who had once walked free among Suzanne's family and neighbors was now in handcuffs, accused of a crime that had shattered their lives nearly 40 years earlier. For the detectives, it was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. For Suzanne's family, it was a moment of painful validation and a flood of memories they had buried long ago. As the news broke, local headlines carried her name again for the first time in decades. DNA leads to arrest in 1980. Murder of teen girl found in San Joaquin River. It was surreal. For those who remembered the case, the teachers, neighbors, even former classmates, it felt like a ghost had finally been named. But in courtrooms, naming the killer is just the beginning. Now investigators had to prove what the DNA had already whispered. And as the case moved toward trial, Suzanne's family would finally come face to face with the man who had stolen their peace, the man whose secret the river had kept for nearly half a century. The next chapter would test their strength, their patience, and their faith in a justice system that had taken 40 years to deliver its promise. They had the name, they had the DNA, but could they finally have justice? When a case this old finally reaches trial, time itself becomes a witness. Every decade that passed, every unanswered question, they all take the stand. In 2018, months after his arrest, Mitchell Lynn Bacon appeared before a Contra Costa County judge. The charges against him were staggering: murder, kidnapping, rape, and oral copulation of a minor under 14. Each count told a part of a story the town had tried to forget, a story of betrayal, violence, and silence. Prosecutors began assembling a timeline that reached back nearly 40 years. It wasn't easy. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded, and key figures in the original investigation were no longer alive. But one thing hadn't changed: the science. The DNA match between Bacon and the evidence collected from Suzanne's body was irrefutable. Experts took the stand, explaining how the biological material had been carefully preserved since 1980, how it was retested decades later using modern forensic techniques, and how the probability of the DNA belonging to anyone else was astronomically low. The defense argued that the evidence was too old, that contamination was possible, that memory had blurred over time. But the jury listened closely as prosecutors described the pattern of Bacon's past crimes, the assaults, the kidnappings, the stalking of women. And the pieces began to fit. Bacon wasn't just a name in a file. He was a predator who had hidden in plain sight. A man who had watched the community grieve, who had walked among the people searching for answers, knowing all along what he had done. In December 2022, After years of pre-trial motions and delays, the verdict was finally read in court. Mitchell Lynn Backham was found guilty on all major counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was announced, the courtroom fell silent. Suzanne's surviving family members sat quietly in the front row, holding hands. There were no cheers, no tears of triumph, only the kind of silence that comes when a wound begins, at last, to close. Justice took 42 years, one relative said softly, but at least it came. For the detectives who had inherited the case, men and women who hadn't even been born when Suzanne was killed, it was a career-defining moment. But for her family, it was something deeper. Closure, yes, but also a haunting realization of how close the truth had always been. Backham had been right there in the same neighborhoods, same streets, the same small California city where a teenage girl once dreamed of becoming a teacher. He lived free for decades while the Bombardiers carried an unhealed ache. When the media covered the conviction, the headlines echoed the same sentiment across the nation. After 42 years, DNA brings justice to 14-year-old girl found in San Joaquin River. It was a story of perseverance not just by technology, but by people. People who refused to forget. People who believed that even the coldest cases could one day be warmed by truth. For 42 years, the river kept her secret, but science found its voice, and it spoke for Suzanne. The girl in the river finally found her peace. But just as one story ends, another awakens from the archives. A case colder, stranger, where the killer wasn't a stranger at all. Suzanne Bombardier's story is proof that time does not erase truth. It only buries it, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it back up. Her voice, silenced in 1980, was carried by the current for 42 long years, until science finally let it speak. The river is calm now. The town sleeps again. But somewhere across the ocean, another river whispers a name, one that's been echoing for decades through the mist of the Scottish night. She was young, she was kind, and one summer evening, she never came home. Next episode, whispers from the Levin and the Caroline Glatchen murder case, where friendship turned to betrayal, and a secret was kept for 25 years beneath the rippling water. If this story moved you, don't let Suzanne's name fade again. Click, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss another truth unearthed from the shadows. Because here on Criminal Minds Archives, every story we tell is a voice reclaimed from silence.